even the tank operators in Vietnam who had this pile of shit here, they decided that thing's chat, f it off.
Do you come from a land down under?
Fire! Level first. Right there, hold it. G'day champions! Today on MAC, the M60-A1 in depth. Kind of. So if you're looking for the real in-depth stuff of a complete strip and assemble, tear down, restoration, cleaning, annual services, read out of the manual, this video is not for you. You might need to address the fact that you live in mommy's basement and we need to move forward with life.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
Today's tank, the M60, it's brought to you by Battlefield Vegas, so bloody get online champions right there, hit Battlefield Vegas. The tank's available for rent, so you can actually come out here into Nevada and get a ride on the tank, do a shooting package and fire the main gun out of this beast. So enjoy the video, let's dive in. Okay, so this M60 right here, the one that we're viewing today with Battlefield, is an M60-A1 R.I.S E. R.I.S E stands for Reliability Improved Selected Equipment. So think of it as like a modernization modification package. This particular one is built, designed and manufactured by Chrysler in the Detroit Arsenal tank plant. And the delivery date of this tank right here is the 7th month of 1979. So the concept of this tank officially came about in 1959. That is the M60 designation that supersedes the M48. And essentially, in the roundabout production way of the M60 variant, about 15,000 of these were built. But this tank was never actually officially coined the patent. It's a common misconception. There's a lot of belief out there that the whole entire series was patent tank. I believe, based off the research we've done, that whole patent tank idea was dropped with the M60. However, common practice and common talk, it's still carried through with Patton's legacy with the tanks up to the Abrams. Perhaps because the M60 was not a true ground up design, it was more or less carried over from the M48, and we're going to explore a lot more of that in a moment. So the M60s were rolling out of production in between the years of 1962 all the way to 1980, and the final variant of M60 for the US, the A3, was essentially last seen its tail end of service with the Marines in the Gulf War 1991, the first Gulf War. And the unit production cost of an M60 around that time frame was about $700,000 US. So the M60 really represents a watershed moment going back to its earliest roots for the US tank production. And essentially, we go to the place in the 1950s when the US deploys armor to Korea. And at that time, the US was really in a watershed moment where when they arrived in Korea with the M46 Pershing tanks and the heavier Sherman variants, they ultimately faced off against Soviet tanks and Soviet designed tanks. And that is where they really realized for American tanks that Once again, we've been outmatched in the tank race, both with firepower and speed, particularly with that T-54 and the Korean T-54 copy types. And the US realizes that the mindset had to be shifted. So where we're sitting in World War II, where the mindset is really focused on rapid production and ease and speed of production to get more tanks out onto the battlefield, which ultimately was a winning strategy for World War II, they've kind of stayed with that mentality through to Korea, keeping in mind that we are now in the post-war years. However, once they first hit those first Soviet tanks in Korea, they realized that the whole concept of testing and new development and R&D for US tanks really was lacking at that time. And that began to show when the Soviet T-54, T-55 hit the battlefield with its upgraded capabilities. That's when that was that key moment that really kicked off production into ultimately what became M48, which was the roots for the M60. So that's probably a good picture of where to start before we get into the M60 specifically. So during the Hungarian Revolution, the British actually captured a T-54, and at the time that was considered cutting edge for enemy forces, and the British heavily studied the T-54. And during that study, they conceded that the T-54's armor was far advanced against the British 20-pounder gun at the time, which is an 84mm. And even the British AP and heat rounds were struggling to get through that early T-54 armor. In addition, the T-54's D10 100mm gun was also proving very lethal against anything current that NATO forces had of the time. And that whole entire situation together with even now rumors of T-62 on the way with that 115mm smoothbore high velocity gun, that was kind of the catalyst that really pushed the US and NATO as well to step back into the tank game, step back into the tank race, and proceed with more research and development, ultimately leading to the M60. So one of the first things that came out of that new arms race was the development of that infamous L7 gun. So the British originally came up with the concept of the 105mm L7 gun, and the US had their own variant of the gun, which they had tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground. But the NATO standard of the time was that all of those NATO tanks from Germany, Canada, the US, and so on were it was going to be an L7 gun, L7 barrel that had universal use of ammunition right across the board. However, the carriage and breech block and breech ring itself varied from tank to tank. So one of the key differences with the bore evacuator was that if you look at the shape of it, it's actually higher up top and it still has that low profile close to the barrel underneath. And what that was able to achieve is when the gun was traversed over the back deck, the higher elevation of the bore evacuator on the bottom allowed for a better depression clearance angle when the turret was traversed over the back deck. So the gun itself, at least for the US, was made at the The gun itself was made at the US-based Watervillette tank. It's not a goddamn tank factory. It's a gun factory. Yes. The L7 gun for the US was made at the Watervillette Arsenal in upstate New York. And then the carriage itself, that essentially is what we call the piece that connects the gun to the tank, the gun carriage, was made by Rock Island Arsenal. So again, we're still in that sort of World War II production mentality where subcomponents are still farmed out. The tank itself is designed and assembled by Chrysler, but then you have those other components, and rightly so, because Chrysler's not really deep into the weapons manufacturing business. They leave that to the experts at the Watervillette facility or even Rock Island Arsenal. So that's what you see installed in the 60 today. So composite arms was designed today with fused glass for the plate equipment. And ultimately, we went to the redesign for the whole of the M60 over there that but there are many limitations such as So one of those key differences between all the tanks prior to the M60 right up to the M48, the M48 had that signature shark nose cast front end, and the big difference there is the M60 has that sloped armor hull. Now that was originally conceived, but not for the reason you may think. The first and earliest reasons the M60 was essentially designed to have this shape armor was considering some type of, at the time, experimental applique ERA type armor. And that shaped cast hull front of an M48 was just not ergonomic to fit applique armor on the front of the hull. So that was the real reason they originally went with this shaped hull. But that type of ERA and armor plate was a complicated and complex manufacturing process, and at the time deemed quite expensive. So the armor was scrapped. However, during testing and at the time, they came up with that notion of sloped armor for better ricochet angle. And really, the US was one of the last countries to catch on with that concept, with the Russians being one of the first to develop the idea of the sloped armor. Eventually, with the British chieftain Centurion, that came about through the British side. And then the US, once again, was one of the last ones to adopt that shape, but it is still very effective, even carries on today with a modern Abrams tank. So the sloped armor concept does a few things for you. And the first is that, for example, if you have a 3-inch thick plate of armor at a straight or 90-degree angle, the round has to travel through exactly 3 inches. But when you tilt that armor, the distance of 3 inches is extended, and the round has to travel through a more thicker surface of steel, in addition to increasing that bouncing off ricochet angle. So very effective, so much so it's maintained today on almost all the modern tanks. Additionally, plate steel, rolled homogeneous steel, is much more stronger and dense material and better for armor than cast is. So when a metal is poured into a cast and it's shaped that way, it is very strong, but at some point it's prone to fracturing, whereas rolled homogeneous pressed or hot press sheet steel or heat iron is much more effective at absorbing shock without breaking, because during the casting process, the heat treat is slightly different to where it doesn't necessarily fracture in the same manner that a cast hull would. So that is one of the lasting impressions of the M60 that carried forward. So one of the upgrades that the later M60s did actually have was a different style of road wheel. So the earlier style of road wheel on the earlier M48s and so on was actually steel. And whilst it is much stronger, the weight of all these road wheels really adds up. So they came out with an aluminum road wheel, or aluminium road wheel for you Commonwealth people. The best way to tell that is in the aluminium, either or. It's the same shit, right? Exactly. The ribs in the aluminium wheel are there to obviously add strength, because aluminum isn't as strong as steel. So the easiest telltale way to spot that is through those ribs. And it does save a lot of weight. So that's one of the biggest differences with the M60 upgrade. Mechanical simplicity of this tank. I have never driven or worked around a tank that is more simple than the M60. But remember, the M60 is just a carryover from the M48. There's so many similarities between the two. Rather than being a completely new, different tank, it's just one step above it. So the driver's controls are incredibly simple. His only control panel is what you see here over his right-hand shoulder. And there's minimal switches and controls on here. Almost just a tiny little bit more than what you might see in like a Humvee. So very, very simple. Moving around the compartment a little bit. Several different features, but like master battery power. The driver essentially controls power to the entire tank. He can turn that off with the flick of a switch. Other than that, he does have the driver's night vision periscope, which is vehicle powered, so the controls for that are on the tank as well. He's basically centered in the hull, and that kind of became the norm for tanks beyond World War II. and either side of the driver, that provides room for ammunition storage, but it helps him gain a greater field of view being centered in the tank as opposed to being on one side of it. He's all by himself down here in the hull while the rest of the crew's up in the turret, so he can fall asleep and not really be seen, but when he doesn't answer his commands, he can get a expected kick to the back of the head. It doesn't have the comfort of maybe the Abrams, but we're still not quite at that era of technology just yet. Semi-automatic gearbox, meaning you can choose between neutral, low gear, high gear, reverse, and that's basically it. It is a hydrostatic steering system, meaning when the engine's running, it's driving a hydraulic pump, and much like, say, an excavator, it's under high pressure, and when you steer, you're simply opening a valve that's sending fluid to one side of the tank. Hydrostatic steering also provides true pivot, meaning true pivot is when one track is going forward and the other track is going in reverse at the same time. That's the only way a tank can truly pivot on the spot. And with the exception of perhaps the M48, the M60 was one of America's first tanks that had that feature. Beyond that, very simple gas pedal and brake pedal, and that is the driver's controls. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's that simple. So the driver's personal weapon would have been the good old M3 grease gun, 45 cal. That was the storage space for it, and then he had ammunition for that on board as well. The escape hatch for the tank is directly underneath the driver. It's the type of a setup where you pull a lever and the hatch will just drop out of the tank. And again, very handy in the event of a rollover, or if you need to escape out of the tank under fire. It could be a safer option going underneath there and adopting a fighting position from on your guts rather than trying to get out through the turret and be exposed to enemy fire. So essentially, we talked about early on in the video the R.I.S E package. What that essentially is, and more so for the A1 variant of M60 and onwards, was again that reliability improved selected equipment. So what does that actually focus on? What does R.I.S E even mean? Well, I'm glad you asked, champion, because now you're going to learn. It was essentially a big change in the engine type. So the engine that is in the M60, even the later M48s, was called the AVDS 1790, and we have a separate video coming out for that engine in depth, and it is pretty in depth, so you want to look at that one if you like engines. But that early diesel engine was called the 2 Alpha 2A engine. The engine that got put into the M60 was called the 2 Charlie. So it had a lot more upgrades than the earlier version, and those upgrades being most importantly, they had an modified generator on the side of the engine. It's gear driven, and that was a 650 amp oil cooled generator. So why is it important to have a lot of power for an M60 or any sort of tank? Is we're getting into that stage of technology now where there's more and more tech entering into the turrets, be it advanced sighting systems, advanced radios, turret reverse and elevation motors, and so on. So things that require electrical power going into tank turrets, we need more and more and more power produced by the tank itself. This was achieved a few different ways. The British went the way of what you might call a pony motor or an APU, auxiliary power unit, where a smaller engine kind of runs separately to power the turret, but the US went for more of a simplistic one and done situation, and that was to increase the generator that comes with this engine to that 650 amp. So that's why it's important to have more power. And having a higher output generator doesn't mean you just get power when the tank is in operation on the move, because a lot of armored warfare is kind of sitting engine off in either a defensive position in a harbor or on top of a feature maintaining OBS. With all that equipment running on just batteries, you still need to start up every couple of hours or every day or so and get the batteries charged. The more efficient your alternator or generator is, the quicker the batteries are charged, the less time you have to spend running when you might be stationary in like a hide or a defensive position. So that's a very important upgrade. The next upgrade that they did over M48 was your air cleaner boxes, and we'll take a closer look at those. But the earlier boxes were like a side loading unit, and you'll see that on your M48s and so on in Vietnam. But the M60 essentially went to more of an armored air intake, and they're a top loading unit. So that's another way of spotting the difference in the later M60 variants. Okay, the only other thing that the R.I.S.E package really included was 4 more line items. That was the introduction of the smoke launcher, and then we have our smoke launcher reloadable canister right here. The tank also had 2nd generation night vision, which was improved. The ability to fit applique armor. So when you take a walk around of this 60, you'll see little weld-on bungs, and those are the points where the frame for the ERA would essentially be bolted into. Then the only other modification was the change out of the coaxial machine gun. So US general purpose machine guns of the time prior to this would have been the M60. The US general purpose machine gun of the time being the M60. With that being phased out and upgraded, they had to also upgrade the tank's coax machine gun. So the coax in the 60 is the 240 Bravo model, or Mag 58 for you Commonwealth people. So I'm now sitting here inside the crew commander's cupola, and as you can see from outside the tank, he kind of has a cupola is like a miniature turret on top of a turret, for lack of a better term, and this is essentially where the crew commander would operate out of. The crew commander, he had his own controls for this miniature turret. The trigger for the gun would be on the elevation handle, and then he would have his other hand here traversing. He also has his own sighting system. This is not just used for that machine gun, but this is also to assist the crew commander in directing the gunner onto the target. The crew commander also had the ability to control the tank turret itself. The crew commander could override the gunner's controls and actually traverse the turret left and right and fire the gun if need be. This system might be referred to, for lack of a better term, as the earlier manual hunter-killer system. So the gunner could be traversed at, say, for example, 11 o'clock engaging a target. At the same time, I can be traversed in my mini turret over here on the right, and as soon as the gunner fires, I can traverse the actual tank turret over onto the target and fire again, because that's gonna, if I've got eyes on a target already and we're in a pinch, it's gonna be quicker for me to traverse the turret onto that target and fire, rather than giving the gunner a target indication and having him find it. The other massive advantage that the crew commander has of having his own machine gun is he can use the tracer rounds out of this machine gun to help the gunner find the target. So if I identify a target through this cupola here and the gunner can't see it, I can fire a burst of tracer and just say, watch my tracer, and walk the tracer right into the target and help the gunner find it and then send a round in. So there's a lot of ammunition storage on the floor of the tank for the machine guns, in addition to the massive several hundred rounds bin that sits next to the coax machine gun. Down on the floor, we have excess 7.62 ammo towards the edge, and then the crew commander has more belts for his M85 50 cal down there on the floor of the turret as well. So this tank can carry a lot of ammo on board by comparison to a lot of other tanks of the time. So this spot that I'm in right here would likely be where the crew commander would spend the majority of his time, because one of the biggest weaknesses of armor is lack of vision. You can have all the periscopes and fancy sighting systems you want, having that situational awareness of what's around the tank, not just enemy, but terrain, what your friendly, what the terrain and what your other units are doing, etc. It's very difficult to really get a true appreciation of that from inside the vehicle. So even under fire, usually they would leave it up to the crew commander's discretion as to whether he would be opened up or not. But he has a lot of things to be doing when he's in this position, between manning the radio, navigating using a map, scanning for enemies, scanning for terrain, which route we're going to take. So the crew commander's brain is constantly under duress and stress, and the multitasking that he has to be able to handle is absolutely incredible. to the point where he is easily the most exhausted guy in the tank. So, but as I sit right now, more than likely he'd have his map out, and this would be the most commonplace sitting position for the crew commander in the M60. The overall shape and size of the cupola is specific to mostly M60. And when you look at the earlier M48s, essentially it was a smaller commander's cupola. Same sort of features with the vision blocks, but it's a very small cupola. And then going back to the earlier A1s and A2s pre-Vietnam, the cupola was also so low to the top of the turret that the crew commanders had some vision problems. So the M48s in Vietnam introduced what was called the cupola riser, and it's essentially a spacer kit with periscopes all around it, and then the cupola went up on top of that. But those developments are important because they were essentially what fueled the introduction of this cupola right here. Now the gun that is in this cupola right here, it's called an M85. It is a 50 caliber BMG weapon, but it is not that popular M2 50 cal that everybody knows about. This gun was also a giant pile of shit. And if you want to argue with me in the comments, please do, because it fuels the algorithm. It'll push the video further out into YouTube and we get a bit more money doing that. But there's also proof in the pudding, because if you look at photos and videos from Vietnam, even the tank operators in Vietnam who had this pile of shit here, they decided that thing's chat, fuck it off, and they mounted the M250 on top. So if you put yourself in their shoes and your life is on the line and you're willing to stick your head out of the tank and use an M2 instead of that, that should speak volumes about the reputation that this gun had. It's also got no part of anything to do with the Abrams tank. So take a look one time, M85 50 cal. There's not many in the US in private hands, and there's none firing currently that I know of. So a pretty rare weapon, but it would be kind of cool to see one operating today, as long as you're not relying on it with your life.